So, our first case is Stora Enso was performed to test a HEF calculating tool to investigate HEF for Stora Enso paper in the Mölla mill. So welcome Carina Larsson from Stora Enso Paper and Torun Hammar from RISE Research Institutes of Sweden. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So my name is Carina Larsson, and I'm working as a sustainability specialist at Stora Enso Paper Division. Nymölla Mill have prior experience of the protocols CEPI-10TOES and the paper profile, which both are EPDs. The Stora Enso Group has a long experience of LCA and product environmental footprint. Next slide, please. So, Nymölla Mill is a part of Stora Enso Paper Division and is situated in the very south of Sweden. The mill produces pulp and paper like office papers and the paper for printing. There are about 500 employees and the mill produces 475,000 tons annually. The mill is EMA certified, and anyone who wants to know more about the mill could find the environmental report at storaenso.com. Next slide, please. The goal of the project was to increase and share the knowledge and the experience of implementing product environmental footprint from an industry perspective. Purpose of this case study was to test the product environmental footprint category rules for an intermediate paper. And in this case, it's an offset printing grade delivered as reels. Next. The system boundaries include upstream and core processes, while downstream processes occurring after the paper mill gate are outside the system boundaries according to the category rules given by the PEFCR for intermediate paper. And the functional unit was set to 1 metric ton of saleable paper at the mill gate.
Okay, thank you, Carina. Then I will go over and talk a bit about the results and discussion from this case study. So the focus on the case study was primarily on climate impact, and in particular, the impact of biogenic carbon on the climate impact. So in this picture here, you can see the results from the PEF tool that was used in the case study by Carina. And you can see the distribution that impacted the total impact, which includes fossil, biogenic, and also land use and land use change emissions. To the right, you can see that the fossil emissions had an impact to 99%. So the main impact came from the fossil emissions, while the biogenic carbon had a 0% impact. So we looked into a more detail on how the biogenic carbon is modeled according to PEF and this specific PCR, PEFCR. So there are two different modeling approaches listed in the PEFCR. And for you who are not so familiar with LCA, to calculate climate impact, what you need to do is both to have a flux of a greenhouse gas in the inventory, and then this flux is multiplied with a so-called characterization factor to get the final climate impact. And this flux could either be an uptake or it could be a release of CO2. And these two different approaches that were listed, the first one is called a simplified modeling approach. And in this simplified modeling approach, biogenic carbon dioxide does not have to be listed, neither the uptake or the release. and thus the climate impact from biogenic carbon is 0. In the main modeling approach, the flux should be included. So if you have an uptake of CO2, for instance, it should be listed, or if you have a release. However, the characterization factor, so what you multiply your inventory flux with, is still 0. So this means that the climate impact will still be 0. We also looked at other methods. So here you can see the third approach. It's for the core product category rules for construction products. So these are the rules if you want to develop an EPD, an environmental product declaration for building products, following EN 108/4 with the update from 2019. And here you also need to list your fluxes, so the uptake and release. However, the characterization factor is not 0 here. So if you have an uptake, the characterization factor is -1, which means that you will have a benefit. So you remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is beneficial for climate. And then the release, you have a characterization factor of 1. So if you release carbon dioxide, it will lead to a climate impact. So if you have the same amount of uptake and release in your inventory, the flux, this means that the net effect will still be 0 in the climate impact, but you will display where you have the uptakes and releases. And during one of these seminars with followers, as Sarah mentioned, we discussed this issue and the different options. And then it was suggested that this simplified approach, where you don't list the fluxes at all for biogenic carbon, it should be removed from the PEFCR. Also, we discussed if the main method could be adapted to be more in line with this option 3, so that you would have a characterization factor of either -1 or 1 for biogenic carbon. So these were some suggestions that was brought up during this seminar. Another topic that we have been discussing during this case study is how to handle byproducts, and in particular the byproduct biogas, which is produced in the Nybøle mill. In the PEFCR for intermediate products or papers, it does not state how to handle biogas. There are allocation rules listed for other types of products, but we did not find them to be applicable for biogas. And during this follower seminars, we got some guidance that we could use the circular footprint formula according to the PEFCR guidance. However, this formula, which is used for how to allocate environmental burden of recycling, reuse, or energy recovery, it's not included in the PEF tool that Carina used. So this means that the allocation needs to be performed outside of the PEF tool, which was also one limitation we found. And this is also valid for other types of byproducts, not just biogas. So these are some of the outcomes of the case study. And now Carina will continue with some conclusions.
Yeah, the results of the calculation from PEF and CEPI-10TOES were consistent regarding climate impact. And the PEF tool developed by CEPI is easy to use even for a person with limited knowledge and experience of LCA, but it has its limitations, and we have to remember that it's still under development. One identified issue is a need of change in the Lanka method on land use. There is an interesting ongoing development on this, and yeah, as mentioned before, we had a seminar last week, and a report is expected already in the beginning of next year. Benchmark values has also been discussed and will probably be available in the future, and they could give an unexperienced user an idea if the calculations should give a value of, say, 10 or 1,000 or 10,000 to help to evaluate the results. You can take next picture, please. So my key message is that it's important to build a network, to have someone to discuss with, preferably someone with experience of the PEF and LCA. The PEF tool really gives the paper industry an advantage because it's so easy to use. But it's also important for the credibility and the usefulness of the PEF method to have updated data sets, and this must be prioritized. The PEF for intermediate paper is due for an update, and we have some suggestions on possible improvements. As Torun mentioned before. So we can take the next slide, please. So next steps. As a major player in the European forest industry, Stora Enso as a group will continue closely following the development of the PEF, and of course keep supporting the development of the PEFCR and the update of the datasets, and also keep supporting the development of the PEF tool. So, Torun, do you have something to add?
No, I think you mentioned everything. So I think that was our last slide.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Torun and Karen. Do we have a question in the chat from the audience?
Yes, there have been, I think it was one question in the chat, but that was resolved. I have a few things that I'm curious about.
Yeah.
For example, and I think this goes probably to Torun, when you refer to the EN 15804, of course, that might differ between different program operators, the rest of the framework around it. Have you looked at other program operators, and do you think that it is any difference with this issue with biogenic carbon there?
That was a tricky question. No, I looked at EPD International, but the standard EN 15804, I guess, will be the same independently, but I have not looked at different operators, if I understood your questions right.
Okay, thank you. Do I have time for one more? Sorry?
No, we can say that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen and Torun again. So the next presentation will be the SSAB case on a steel product. And this case study was performed to better understand differences in some methodology issues between environmental product declarations and product environmental footprint. So welcome Jonas Larsson from SSAB and Karin Sanne from IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So Jonas Larsson, I'm heading the environmental affairs at SSAB Group, and part of that is also product environmental issues and so on with LCA, etc. So that's why I have been part of this this project as well. But anyhow, about the company in brief, we are a steel company then. We have production in Sweden, Finland, and in the US. Here in the Nordics, it's iron ore-based steel production, and it's scrap-based in the US. Production capacity, 8 million tons or something, eight or nine. So we are not that large, but I would say that we have a really strong position in the niche of high-strength steels on the global market. However, the climate is on top of the agenda today, and we have also some ambitious plans within that area as well. We are aiming to be first in fossil-free steel, and we are also planning for the market introduction of these products already in 2026. And then the latest by 2045, we will also be fossil-free for the entire company, so to say. But that's about the next step, maybe. With today's production and the products we have today, we have the EPDs, the environmental product declarations, and they were updated last year or published early last year. And that work has also been a basic for this case study when it comes to data and the experiences that we have from the EPD system and so on, that we have compared them to the PEF. So with that said, I think I hand over to you, Karin, for the results, and then I will come back in the end of the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Jonas. I have some problems to change. My name is Karin Sanne, and I'm from IVL, the Swedish Environmental Research Institute. And in this case study, together with SSAB, we have focused on 4 main objects. And we have compared an already performed EPD for steel produced by SSAB with PEF, the PEF-CR for metal sheets. And our focus have been on looking at environmental indicators, requirements for generic and specific data, allocation methods, and also a future looking into low carbon steel making. We have compared all the environmental indicators needed for EPD and PEF to see if there are differences. And as you can see here, most of them are the same. So calculating the same models, we get also the same results in the indicators. Despite one, and that's a biogenic climate change category. And it's also similar conclusions that you heard in the previous case study. It's about the biogenic carbon, and I can't click here. So Sarah, maybe you can help me. It's an animation here.
Yeah, you can take remote control again, Karin.
Okay.
So you can.
But I already have remote, so give up remote control, I have to say.
Okay, I can help you.
Yeah, I have some animations. I hope it will work. So you can take some more here. So almost all are the same, except the difference in the biogenic climate change. And you also see a small difference for the non-cancer human toxicity at the bottom, but we have not looked more into that details. So next slide, Sarah, and you can take the animations as well. So for the fossil carbon dioxide, it's the identical factors, but the difference is for the biogenic. So some more animations here. We have slightly different factors for the biogenic methane, but the big difference is for the biogenic carbon dioxide, where the EPD framework methodology applies a factor of 1 for the inputs, the uptake, but the PEF has a factor of 0 for the uptake. Now we have looked into steel, where biogenic CO2 is not a major issue, so it's not a big thing just for the product steel, but important to remember this difference for other more bio-based materials. Yeah, to sum up, almost all are the same, except the biogenic, and also a small difference in the non-cancer human toxicity category. The second object was to look into the data requirements. And for EPD, we have the following requirements. We should use a specific data primarily, and especially for processes which the producer has operational control over. Generic data may be used for processes that the producer cannot influence, can be upstream, downstream, and any generic data can be used as long as it follows the requirements in the PCR. So that means that there are no specific chosen generic data that needs to be used for the EPD framework according to the PCR. And if we then look at this for the PEF methodology and the PEF-CR, the PEF-CR for meta sheets, we have different situations, and in this case it's a situation 1, and there it says it needs to be specific data for all processes run by the company, same as for the EPD, and the PEF-CR also provides a list of generic data that shall be used. So that's a difference compared to the EPD methodology and rules. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to find this data, and that's also a learning that it's difficult to just see the data before you really do a PEF. So they will be available, as you heard before, when you perform a PEF, but not really public available in advance. The third object we compared was the allocation methods. And there are different guidance documents, as many of you probably know. It's a GPI and the PCR for the EPD. It's also a CPCR under development. And for the PEF, we have the PEF-CR for meta sheets. There are different methods for allocation. In EPD, it's a cutoff rule. And we also have the module D as an additional information. And in the PEF, it's a circular footprint formula that needs to be used. If you look at the point of substitution in PEF, it's decided that it should be at slab, which means after melting the steel. But for the EPD, the PCR for the EPD, it's not that well explained, so it's also room for interpretation, and in this case study we have assumed the same as PEF. If you look at what is the substituted material that you should take into account in this formula, in PEF it clearly states that it's a value for virgin raw material, 100% virgin raw material, but again it's not clear in the PCR, so we have assumed the same as PEF in this case study. And how will then the result look like? And in the circular footprint formula, there is a factor called A, and that's used to allocate the benefits and impacts from the material recycling to the one generate waste or the one using the waste. A is set as a default to 0.2, and then the results look like this. For the EPD, you have a result of global warming potential 2.2 with a D factor minus 1.5, and the PEF result is 0.99. Now we have some more animation. So and if you would add together A, B, C, and D, which you should not do, then you have the 0.7 for the EPD. But back again. But this is how it should look like. If we then change the factor A to 1, and 1 means that all environmental impacts, benefits are allocated to the user of the waste, then we get this result, the 2.2. And if we change it to 0 and instead have all environmental impact and benefits to the waste generator, we get the result of 0.7, which then is very similar to this A to D in the EPD framework. So it's a lot of details. It's a very complicated formula. I think what's important to have in mind is that how this is calculated will really influence the number in the end, the carbon footprint, if you look at that. We have some similarities, but also differences between the EPD and PEF framework. And many products in the society consist of steel, which is example in this case study, and even more on recycled material. So this is a really, really big thing in the communication part to understand how the A factor have been used and how it influenced the results. Then we move to the last object in this case study, and that's a future looking scenario where we go to low carbon steel making. That means that scope 1 and scope 2 direct emissions and emissions from energy almost become zero. And our assumption here is that cradle to gate together with the end of life will be given neutral carbon impact or climate impact, or maybe also negative global warming potential values. In this comparison, in this graph we will show on next slide, we have assumed the cradle to gate global warming potential to 0.4. This is just an assumption. And then we see the results in this way. For the EPD, you see the A to C, 0.4, and you have the D module. If you look at PEF, it becomes a negative value by using the A factor 0.2. Which means that when we move into the more low carbon steel making scenario, carbon footprint for that product according to the PEFCR as it is today, using the virgin steel as substitution material will give a negative value for the global warming potential. And with that, I hand over to Jonas and some reflections from this case study.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as we saw or heard Karin say, I would say that we are using more or less the same calculation data for independent on the methodology. And because of that, we can also get the same total result out of this, even if the requirements are a bit different, but it's at least possible to have the same result, especially if we change the method or how to read the result in an EPD and allowed us to also calculate the net GWP and include the module D in the total. However, in practice, this will not be the case, and I think that the EPD and the PEF will actually represent two extremes when we are using, let's say, a global warming potential as a purchasing criteria. And depending on if we are referring to the EPD or the PEF, the result will be the total different results. If we start with the EPD, we have seen at least on the market and in connection with our customers and so on, that there is a very strong focus on the cradle to gate or the modules A1 to A3. Even if the reporting of module D has been mandatory now in the later version, but the focus in purchasing is still A1 to A3. And when you focus on that, it will be a result when we have used the cutoff approach, and that will also very clear promotes the recycled content in the product. Even if it's for steel, we have a situation where the steel scrap is actually a limited resource, and there are not that much scrap available to meet the total demand. So that's could be a problem there. On the other hand, if we look at the PEF, we could, if we start with the cradle to gate result, we could find the similar thing there, but then we also add the end of life part, or what is referred to as the module D in the EPDs. A bit different is that the PEF is also putting the value to the scrap in a different way. In the EPD, you have the result of or the value of the scrap as a net scrap calculation as part of the module D, but in the PEF, you have it in two parts of the formula or the circular footprint formula. So you're actually given burden to the scrap input, and then you are given a credit for the recollected scrap. So it's two parts, but the net will be the same, so to say. And this will then focus on the recycling at end of life, and this will also promote the concepts of the circular economy. So reflection or conclusion from my side is that I think that PEF is developing in the right direction. And I think also that PEF had the potential to be maybe a stronger tool than the EPD as a tool for the purchasing part, because of the fact that they are including the whole life cycle in a more complete way than the EPD. Yeah, I think that was my conclusion so far.
Great, thank you so much, Jonas and Karin. So Björn, do we have any one question for Karin and Jonas?
Yeah, one question, and this regards to the first part of the project, not to part 3. And the question is, which modules were included in the total EPD results? If I remember correctly, module D is now mandatory, but the results from different modules should not be added. In particular, I think results from module D should not be added to the rest.
As far as I know, I think it's a credit to GATE, because this is an already performed EPD before it's mandatory to have the D module. Maybe Jonas want to add something more?
Yeah, we have the module D result is displayed in the EPDs, but we haven't, of course, not did the total summary when we include the D, because that is not in line with the PCR documents and so on.
Thank you.
So when we calculate the net result in this study, that is more to give an example how it should look like, but it's not in line with the reporting in the EPD.
Thank you. And we will save the other questions to the panel dialogue. So, our next speaker is Sofia Polykido. Sofia will present results from the project Impacts on Conflicting Rules for LCA, another project carried out within the Swedish Life Cycle Center. Sofia Polykido is the project manager for this project and researcher from IVL, the Swedish Environmental Research Institute. And she will give you a deeper knowledge in similarities and differences in PEF and EPD. So Sofia, welcome, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you and welcome to this presentation. I'm very glad to be here and part of this webinar. I see the title of the presentation slightly changed. I don't know why. Sorry, and I don't seem to have control of the presentation. So anyway, I will present the results basically focusing on similarities and differences between PEF and EPD. My name is Sofia and I work at EVL, Lifecycle, Swedish Environmental Research Institute. This project has been carried out within IVL and coordinated also by the Swedish Life Cycle Center. And it's funded by the Swedish Energy Agency. It involves a lot of partners, both from industry, the vehicle fuel production industry, but also research institutes and other researchers. And we call the project ICON, so it's impact from conflicting rules on life cycle assessments. So today we'll have a short introduction on the project, focusing on the aim and the approach, and then talk to you about the similarities and differences, some of which we have already listened to, based on examples from the ICON project. And then hopefully at the end, we'll also have time for some questions. Sorry. So, yes. Well, what we have here also today, we see that the use of LCA and LCA-related information is increasing during decision making, and multiple actors may get requests from LCAs in various contexts, both to be used internally in the organization for product development activities, but also externally within with their customers or even within regulatory requirements. And those different contexts and different methods that need to be applied may require different choices that have, like, in terms of scope or system boundaries or data demands. And we see some examples here in the picture on the right side. So we have the EPD system, as we discussed, we have the PEF, well, the basic LCA standards, but also, of course, the Renewable Energy Directive. And the results will be, this will result in a variety of outcomes in some cases, increased needs of resources and expertise for the industry, and then, of course, a little bit of confusion. So in this project, we have been focusing on increasing understanding of the requirements of the different frameworks, and to what extent the multitude of LCA approaches gives conflicting recommendations on the environmental requirements and how we can reduce those negative impacts. And of course, the overall aim is to make all the actors involved in the project more informed and to be prepared to actively take part in discussions. So in our scope or in our project, we have specifically looked into fuel producers. So we have performed case studies looking on transportation fuels, where we applied 3 different frameworks: the PIF, the EPD, but also RED, that it's a very important framework for the fuel industry. But I will not talk so much about RED today. I will focus more on PEF and EPD. And we also try to have a variety of case studies and variety of feedstocks that can give a little bit of insight how the different methods handle different methodological requirements. So we have energy crop, recycled materials, but also residues becoming transport fuels. Going directly to the similarities and the difference, this is a selection. Some of these we have heard before. We see that between EPD and PEF, I mean, the purpose is kind of the same. We have this need for harmonization or for increasing the transparency and communication, of course, to external partners, and comparability of results. We have in both cases a multiple impact assessment categories included in the assessment, and this is, of course, in contrast to RED, that usually focuses only on greenhouse gas emissions. But we see also that there are different characterization factors sometimes applied when it comes to, for example, global warming potential, as we highlighted before. The system boundaries, it's also a little bit of the same, treated in the same way, let's say, but those studies are usually having a life cycle perspective from cradle to grave or cradle to gate, as we also saw before. But when we apply the methods and when we work on the methods on more specific case studies, we see that there might be differences based on different methodological assumptions. And another difference that we came across was in terms of multifunctional processes. That is something that is very often discussed in LCAs, and it's something very commonly coming up in every LCA study, more or less. How multifunctional processes, like processes that can produce more than one product than the product in focus, shall be treated. And we have anything from allocation to system expansion or substitution, depending on the method used. And in both cases, we did not have a PCR or a PCR for renewable fuels. And that was something that we identified as a limitation, and also something that kind of made our work a little bit more difficult because we did not have this very specific guidance, and also it left a lot of room for interpretations in both cases. Going to some examples on these differences from the case study. We see here that the EPD and PEF may require different modeling approaches, and especially for products that are based on waste streams, different system boundaries may be applied. In the picture here, you see some examples from biogas production and also from production of pyrolysis oil based on used tires. In the case of the PEF, we use the carbon footprint formula to draw our system boundaries. and also create our system. But on the other hand, the EPD framework, it was based on the system boundary was based on the polluter pays principle, where the impact of the biogas system to be used as vehicle fuel, so biomethane, starts from the upgrade of biogas. So all the upstream impacts are not included in the process. And you see in the figures how the results vary a little bit based on the different system boundaries, or among others, based on the system boundaries applied. The goal is not really to look on the quantitative values. So I realize that's of course quite small values, but it's mainly to illustrate the differences in the results and in the systems. Another example come again from fuels or transport fuels that are based on residues streams or recycled streams. We had one case looking on ethanol from bread residues and one case looking from H2O from used cooking oil. And in this case, the PEF seemed to result in a slightly higher impact, mainly because of the factor EV, the virgin material, coming into the CFF formula. We interpret it as the impact of substituted material, and in this case, the virgin material that can be used instead of the recycled material has to be in the calculation. But again, we did not have a clear guidance on this because there was no PCR or PCR available. So we had to make our own interpretations. We tried to be in contact with relevant actors from the PEF community. So this is a little bit how what we ended up with. So we see a clear difference between the PEF and EPD in this respect. And finally, one other aspect, as I mentioned, was the multifunctional processes and how allocation was treated. Again, there was a room for interpretations, even in the base, in the generic guidelines, the GP, the general product instructions in case of PEF, or the generic guide 6.3 in case of PEF. So the results also show a little bit a slight variation based on what type of allocation approach that will be followed, or how multifunctional processes will be treated. And you see some examples again from the bread residue case study, but also from products or from fuels based on energy crops, rapeseed and corn for the ethanol case. So in the case of transport fuels, it will not be really harmonized results when we compare these two frameworks at the end. Some concluding remarks. Well, the method or the framework seem to have the same purpose, but different approaches at the end, at least on a generic level, like in the general instructions. It would have been very interesting to see what will happen later on if we have more like specific product category rules and how they will be developed and if they will be aligned in some way. So there is some need for harmonization, especially for those that are initiated at least in an EU level. And if we had the comparison with RED in this presentation, I think it's also like a greater need, because we talk about regulation then, and we talk about industry that needs to, for example, apply RED, but then on the other hand, they might get requests for EPD or PEF. So it will be a lot of extra work, I think, for them. We think it's important that actors are informed that there are different frameworks available, that there are differences in the methods applied, and that this can lead to different results, and to be informed about what these results represent at the end. And last but not least, we think that more support is needed, both in the case of PFCRs and PCRs for renewable fuels, but also for more specific PEF and CFF guidelines, so that we have more like official documentation on what those values and guidelines represent. Yes, and by that I would like to thank you for your attention. It was a quick overview of our work, and great thanks to all of the partners that have been involved in this project. You see our contact details, and also that we have a final seminar or webinar of the project on the 14th of December. Sarah, thank you. Are you there? Sorry.
Now I have back the remote control
okay,
button, so I can unmute myself. So thank you so much, Sofia.
Thank you.
Björn, do we have a question clarifying question for Sofia?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking now, since you were into this issue with the fact that there are no PCR or PEFCR for these fuels. Do you think that that would be the suitable level to have these rules on, or should they rather be on fuels? I mean, when you can use biofuels, in principle the way that you use a fossil fuel, shouldn't it be preferable to have the same rules for all these fuels?
If I understood the question correctly, you mean both fossil fuels and also renewable fuels? Yes, or I mean, of course, then there is also like, of course, fuels for transport or fuels for other purposes. I mean, it's really like a broad sector or very broad context. Well, it can be, but on the other hand, we see more and more that transport fuels, and especially like biofuels, they become complex because it's not so much of a linear process anymore. Like, for example, oil extraction, production, etc., etc. They have all these flows of materials and even like cross-sectoral, let's say, processes when a byproduct or an output of one process then suddenly becomes an input or a feedstock to produce a biofuel. So I think this aspect has to be really like taken into consideration how we model these processes, especially for secondary or advanced biofuels, I would say. If we want to make the sector even more complex, we have like biogenic capture of biogenic carbon that then becomes a fuel. For instance, we have electrofuels, we have electricity, etc., becoming a fuel. So I think it's a rather complex sector. It's becoming a rather complex sector, so it really needs some specific guidance and attention. On the other hand, we see development on the RED directive level, and this should also be aligned to the rest of the LCA kind of, or the other way around, or I don't know where to start actually, from LCA to RED or from RED to LCA. So it's really like a need there, I would say. Yes, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did.
A little bit of some very spontaneous thoughts on that.
No, thank you. It's a very good answer, and I'm really looking forward to December 14th. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks to all 3 presentations. So it's time to invite the panelists. So welcome back, Björn, Carina, Jonas, Sofia, and Torun. And the panel dialogue will focusing on reflections and learnings from working with PEF in different ways. So before we start with this part, I have a question for Torun and Carina regarding the Lanka method. You mentioned the Lanka method and that it needs to further develop. What problems do you see, and how do you see these problems can be solved?
Yeah, I don't know, Carina, do you want to add on that?
No, please, Torun, take the floor.
Yeah. Well, that was a quite difficult question. So we calculate the land use impact according to the Lanka method in the study, but we did not focus on it. And we had a seminar within the project on the Lanka method last week, where different issues was brought up that needs to be worked on to update the method. So I'm not an expert on the method, but I know there are some difficulties or issues with it, that it doesn't represent Swedish forest correctly, and not different types of forestry systems. Do you want to add something on that, Carina?
No, I think you captured the big picture.
Great, thank you. So, Björn, What do you think has been the most valuable outcome for you and your organization from this project?
Well, I think that there has been the kind of this general building of Swedish environmental footprint awareness and competence. I think that is what I see kind of in society or in the concerned parties, that I feel extremely happy about that this is happening and that we're on the right track. And if I'm to be a bit more specific, I think this, as I mentioned a bit previously on the increased cooperation around the technical advisory board and the engagement that we have had through this project, and the way that we have been able to utilize research that we have been funding to influence the development of the environmental footprints. I think that is something that I'm really talking within my organization about. Thank you.
Thanks. And Jonas, what was the most valuable outcome for you in your organization from this case study? Any lessons learned? You can
the outcome, it was the possibility to get a better understanding of the PEF methodology, and also to compare it then with EPDs and see the differences and the similarities and so on. And so that's the outcome. Of course, we had done some estimates or try to use the circular footprint formula on our own in beforehand and so on. So it was a way to confirm that we have done it in a correct way and so on. Regarding the lessons learned, or maybe more like a conclusion from our side, is that we may need to go towards the kind of methods that really include the whole life cycle. And I think that the PEF methodology is a really good example of the methodology that do that. So that's what I have learned from this, I would say.
Thank you. And Carina, from your perspective and your work, what are the main lessons learned? And,
yeah, I agree with Björn that building network and having a wider knowledge of PEF and also bringing this discussions with the limitations of the PEF and for intermediate paper, the PEF tool. So that's the big advantage and the big outcome of this project.
And from the researcher perspective, Sofia and Torun, what any reflections on that, or do you agree with Björn and Carina and Jonas, or do you have any other thoughts and values for you?
Well, I agree, but I think it's for me as an LCA practitioner and researcher, it's really been a very important project, and I learned a lot about the PEF methodology and differences between different methods, and also the work behind PEF, so to say, and that it's not so easy to develop and harmonize method, I would say. And I think it's been very important to test the method in the case study, because I think when you test the method yourself, or even Carina did most of the calculation, it's really when you understand how it works.
Could you give some examples of issues or
Well, me personally, I've been working with a project with PEF and EPD at the same time, and the methods are in many ways similar, but then again, they're not. And that's a bit of a challenge to keep a track on which method am I focusing on at the moment. So I think as a LCA practitioner, it will also be a bit of a challenge to really be up to date and know all about the different methods at the same time.
And Sophia, in your work with all these case studies?
Yes, I can only agree with what has been said before, that it was really like a very nice experience just working hands-on with case studies and applying the different methods, because this is more when you really like get to the deeper understanding of the methods and looking at the documents and try to understand. We had a broad network of researchers working on case studies. We had 8 different case studies and more or less 8 different people working on those. So it was also interesting to see how we interpret even similar products and similar processes in different ways, how we need to align even like among ourselves. And I think one other learning outcome specifically from this project, what we also try to communicate, because we work a lot with the fuel producing industry, we kind of try to communicate that there are also like other frameworks available or other ways to do LCAs apart from RED, for instance, and but also give additional information, for instance, in other environmental impact categories, etc. So yeah, I think this is the most important kind of outcomes. And we also, of course, try to highlight the strengths, but also the limitations and improvement areas, as Torun also said.
What do you think is the most important improvement area? Could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, I would say consistency. I mean, of course, Evel also talked about that the main need was to reduce the room for interpretations, make as most consistent methodologies as possible. And I think there is still room for improvement on that. Because, yeah, the guidelines, especially for PEF, was quite vague in certain cases, at least. I don't know if it's possible to ever like find one solution, but.
And do you have some examples on that?
Yeah, I mean, allocation, let's say multifunctional process was one example, and it's always coming up in LCA studies. I mean, we all know that. And yeah, there's still a lot of discussions around the LCA community as such, but even in those very like specific tools, they come again and again.
Mm-hmm. So a reminder, please ask questions through the chat to the panelists. They will be more than happy to answer them. So what do you think was the biggest challenge for you where you're working on this case study, and how did you overcome this, Jonas? Jonas, you are muted now.
Sorry. Okay. Challenging. I think the major thing was around the data collection and the fact that it was quite tricky also to get the generic data for the PEF methodology. Before the project, we thought that would be quite simple because you have defined databases and so on, but in practice that was not the case for this kind of study. So yeah, I think that was the most tricky part. Otherwise, I think it was at least no surprises, even if there are a lot of challenges in this.
Yeah, and Carina, you said that also in your presentation. Anything you would like to add on this challenge?
I agree with Jonas. It's the biggest challenge for me was to find and validate the data, and with that I don't mean that I mean that we have so much data. It's the big question is which one should I take, and which one should I use? Yeah, that was the biggest challenge.
How prepared do you think your organizations are now when it comes to PEF, to handle PEF within the future, Carina?
Yeah, I'm thinking we are very good prepared. It's always easy. It's a tricky question when you ask about the organization, because Stora Enso is a very big company, and the questions like this, then I have to think about: are we talking about Stora Enso Group, or are we talking about Stora Enso Mill, Nymölla Mill?
For the Nymölla Mill.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think that Stora Enso as a group is very well prepared, and it will be interesting to see the following discussions.
And for Nymölla Mill. No, we lost her. So, and Jonas, how prepared do you think you are at SSAB?
Yeah, it's hard to answer, but at least I feel that it developed in the right direction, and it feels better and better. Of course, we are not ready to move from EPDs to the PEF methodology today in the reporting or in the public reporting, so to say. But we are moving in that direction, and we are learning all the time. So it's hard to say if we are 50% ready or something else, but it's really valuable for us at least to participate in this kind of project, because then we are moving ahead in the development here. But of course, it will be could be an obstacle with the need for new PCR documents and so on. It may take some time to have that in place and so on. So.
Björn, how do you see PEF in the coming years?
I think it was a good slide by Imola with a lot of different initiatives and ways to use the environmental footprints. Of course, we will have the communication on the green claims and on the sustainable products initiative in Q1 next year. So we are very engaged there and are watching out for what will happen, and I think everyone should. And as for those who are engaged in or who are producers of products under the current Ecodesign Directive, I think that's another way, of course, that it can be used. And like for the battery regulation, the proposed battery regulation, and the taxonomy. So I think we will see probably a broad implementation. That's my guess.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is needed for industries to start test PEF or parts of the PEF tool?
Sorry. I think first of all, I think one needs to kind of understand how it affects one's business. I think it's when you have that kind of acceptance. I mean, if when you work with sustainability in a company, you have always, I would say, a very engaged sustainability professionals department or unit, and then of course this is one of these things is to engage the management and even the board, I would say. And once you have that acceptance, it's a lot easier to argue that the area where you are working that is essential for the long-term business viability of the company, and that you need the resources to work proactively with these issues. And I think it's also important to, I would say, realize something that has been obvious within the Swedish Life Cycle Center now for these 25 years, that you are very few within each company organization that are working with these issues. You can't do it all within your company. You need to cooperate both with your peers within business organizations, of course, which are very important in, for example, developing PEFCRs, and also in within organizations like the Swedish Life Cycle Center. And I think what to do now, if you're a company, get engaged in PEFCR development.
So, Jonas and Carina, will your companies be active in the PEFCR revision or development in the future?
Yeah, we have an interest there. Exactly how to deal with that, I don't know. We was not part in the previous pilot, but of course we have followed that work. We are discussing this in our European Industry Association, Eurofair, right now. And I would be surprised if we are not involved in that work via that organization at least. But how we should act as a single company, I'm not sure today.
And Carina, you answered that in the chat. Something you add?
No. Stora Enso will for sure be active, and we have in the committee who is developing this PEFCR delegates from Stora Enso, so we'll continue.
Great. One last question before we summarize. So it's a question for all. How shall businesses use and rely on for the coming years if it's not clear if PEFCRs are going to be supported in the future? Why should we go for PEF instead of EPD if certain PEFCRs are eventually not activated in the future? And if someone like to reflect on that, maybe utilize with that. Yeah. What do you think?
It was hard to hear. What is it? The last question in the chat?
Yes. How should businesses use and rely on PEF for the coming years if it's not clear? So why should we go for PEF instead of EPD if certain PEFCRs are eventually not activated in the future?
For us, it's more about what kind of methodology we are that we think should be promoted here. But of course, it will be a decision made of our customers more or less, and we have to fulfill their requests for information and so on. My guess would be that we will, at least for some years, use the EPDs and the PEF in parallel or so. We will, of course, we cannot change to anything that is not still that robust and so on, if some documents, guidance documents and so on is lacking. But yeah, so it's hard to know right now. I think we have to work with both of them.
Yes. Anyone that would like to add comment? The last comment.
I would say that also one should not forget that there is the possibility to work for further harmonization between these methods.
Great. So thank you so much, Björn, Sofia, Jonas, Carina, and Torun. And I will continue. And thanks also for the questions in the chat. So to conclude the project results and outcomes from environmental footprint in Sweden, the project team has summarized our outcomes in the following. Increased dialogues between LCA experts on methodology issues and on the PEF development, both within Sweden but also broader on an European level. Increased coordination between LCA experts and increased representation from Sweden in the EU Environmental Footprint Technical Advisory Board, like Björn said, and the project participants in Swedish Life Cycle Center have definitely broadened our collaboration and our network among professionals. We have also created engagement and dialogues with new organizations, both we already have LCA experts and practitioners, but also with non-LCA experts, both for learning and impact on the development. And we also have some reflections to share with you. Some of them have been presented earlier during this webinar as well. So in the end, one number is requested or presented, but it's so much information and work and learning behind that number. It's so complex, and the overall PEF process has definitely increased the interest for LCA in general, and many discussions and collaborations have been possible thanks to this PEF process. And we think there are some potential to simplify parts of the PEF documentation to make it more readable and understandable, like Torun said from that case study. And we also think it's important to test PEF, and therefore data needs to be accessible, and it could be also good to have access for a tool for testing, like Carina said, that the CEPI tool, and the harmonization between methods, systems and approaches, which is both requested and needed, like Björn said. And we also encourage you to test PEF for both learning and impact the development of PEF, and to be part of this PEF method development. And we believe that industry associations have an important role for developing new PEFCRs and for competence building within your sector. And supporting actions for SME is also needed. We see that there are some opportunities to learn from other work within EU, for example, the work within eco-design, where a calculations template has been developed. So now it's time to go into the menti.com and use the code 92508594 to hear from you, your learnings and reflections from today's webinar. Yeah, and you can see the code in the chat. So menti.com and the code 92508594. And for this last reflection part, I have also invited Ellen Wiese. Ellen, are you here?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, I'm here, but I have had a lot of technical difficulties and haven't heard all that I would have liked to hear, to be honest. So I don't know what to do with this.
So, Ellen Wiese, you are from the company, from the Essity company. You have been involved in the very beginning of development of the PEFCRs for intermediate paper products. And you've also been actively involved in the Swedish Life Cycle Center expert group on environmental footprint. What is your biggest lesson from your work within the PEFCR development?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people here in the call have been there more or less the whole time as well, but we can say so that Essity started already in the beginning of 20 years ago. Then we started to create product category rules for EPDs. So for that matter, it's a quite natural kind of thing to see to that the category rules for your product group is something that you need to be active part of when they are going to be established. So for that, I would say that it was mentioned with trade associations and so on. Yes, industry really needs to be active when the category rules are established. And in order to give good input at that work, then one needs to have done quite a lot, I would say, of homework before, so that one can give good input to it. And when we really had a close work with the Commission when we did it, because they were part of our, whatever the group was called at that time, the task force working with it. And when we kind of had ideas that we didn't like that was proposed to us, we need, of course, to come with some kind of alternative instead. And that's the reason why it's so important that you have done more than one LCA before you start in this work. That is my really takeaway, that as many companies as possible should be so knowledgeable so that they can handle the discussions around the category rules that are going to be established. And then also for the future, think about on what level the data should be delivered, because it's easy to get carried away of saying how detailed things should be when they need to be on your company level, of course, but the total understanding of how things are for the industry is, to be honest, not always understood by let's say other authorities, and not sometimes by ourselves as well. It's really worth thinking of if you have many production sites with many machine production lines and so on, to think about how do we want to pile up average, or how detailed do we want to use our data. And then with data, I also need to say it is really important that each and everyone takes this grasp of how to start to collect data in the production sites, so they can be not only collected once, but on a regular basis and so on and so forth. Because if PEF takes off, then we also need to update things. We need to have a regular new data in it. And we want to prove our own industry as a good one. How can we see to that we can establish such routines so that we don't only do one major effort to collect the set of data, and then you realize, okay, I need to do this every second, third year maybe. So this strategy about handling the data is also very important. And a lot of other salient things, and a lot of things that I've already heard that people said, but it's important to do this homework part. I think that's my greatest takeaway. And it's a nice and interesting work, and you meet a lot of good colleagues as well. So yeah, I would say everyone should go for it. It's nice, but challenging.
Now we're inspired to really join this development. Thank you, Ellen.